we would like to explore ways in which we could continue to build our strong and valued partnership with the Bahamas. So the proceedings are going to start with a sort of one-on-one interview with Mrs. Anastarcia Palacious, who is going to introduce and interview the High Commissioner. And then they'll be followed by a question and answer session. And after that, there will be a reception. So we'd like to all join us in some fellowship afterwards. Thank you and enjoy the evening.
Real global portfolios and the like. I would urge the industry here really to be recognized for quality of service, for quality of advice, and for the returns that your customers get, and that servicing. And if you're there, then the people will pay the premium, and we'll have a different discussion as to whether this is a viable industry or not, or whether we are really in the fringes and margins surviving because we just have a slightly better house of straw providing some sort of protection to a company or an individual.
Okay. Well, certainly a lot was said there, and many things coming out of that discourse. First about Brexit and where it puts you, and then of course about that position of financial services and how we kind of reshape the way we think about the way that we offer our services here. And certainly some more things that I want to get into as we continue this conversation. My next question was actually going to be about the European Partnership Agreement that we've signed onto, and you've kind of given us a good understanding that that's going to be looked at differently now, and the services that we engage in will be looked at differently as a part of that agreement. Are there anything specifically that you could give us in terms of the transition arrangements and what departments the Bahamas should be liaising with today as we prepare for that transition in terms of that EPA agreement?
Sure. First, let me say, I mean, I alluded to it before. I think the original construct of the EPA, I don't think it really is right for today's world, and I'm not even sure it was right when it was put together. I think too many compromises were being adapted, and it was not just the Caribbean, it really reached out right across to the Pacific. I mean, I think it was just trying to do too many things with too many interests, and the French had their own interests, we had ours, and the negotiators on the other side. And to some extent, over here, if you like, the Caribbean club was not sufficiently unified to be able to really sway the discussion one way or the other. Sometimes you relied on Jamaica, or sometimes Trinidad, sometimes the Bahamas had something, and it sort of got over the line. So if you look at the overall effect of it now, I mean, who is actually using the agreement? Very few. The Bahamas as an exporter of non-service goods is pretty small, and it's highly specialized in what it does. And I can't imagine that would be that affected by tariffs, even if they are low. So I think what is more important is to make sure that it is not on the basis of special and differentiated treatment for countries, because many of the countries have graduated anyway into middle income or about to. It really is about making sure that there's as little friction as possible for goods and services to travel between these two sides. And there, the UK will always be a champion of free trade. And I think the EU is largely in that space because of the influence we've had over the last decades of membership. I hope that sentiment continues once we leave, but we have made it very clear that we want to be champions of free trade, and we will not put up protection barriers just for our own narrow interests. The only exceptions will be sensitive areas like nuclear power and defense. But even in nuclear power, the Chinese and the French are building our next generation of nuclear power stations, so we're not totally shut down in that space. So we will not be defensive in talking to the Bahamas. So if you say that you want some mutual recognition of professional qualifications, we can have a discussion about it. I'm not saying cast iron guarantee that someone qualified here is automatically qualified there, but we can have a conversation because it'll be just the two of us talking. And then because we have a common law and a Commonwealth base, many of these things are actually transferable. I was talking to people who deal in the medical profession, a returning achieving scholar. You don't need a huge amount of translation between what you learn here and practice in each other's countries. So I see that taking shape as well. But overall, I'll only speak for the UK. Our trading performance with the Bahamas and the wider Caribbean has been abysmal. And when I say abysmal, it's because the cake has grown over the last 30 years. The Bahamas needs more and does more, but the overwhelming market share of that is the United States. Some of it is understandable because it's an immediate neighborhood, but the French are doing something, we are, and the Chinese are, of course, increasingly involved. But we have become a shadow of what we were here, and part of our engagement here today is also to wave the trade flag and say there are things that we have that the Bahamas needs. And I started with a few. LNG, I think, is something that this country really needs to look at seriously. But you have to look at it in the point of view of becoming serious players. What do I mean by that? Right now, because the market is soft, you can choose whether you want liquid fuel or LNG or anything else. But the market will tighten. These things go in cycles. So those who consume gas now can basically play it in the spot market. You can just hail a tanker like you would hail a cab and say, can you offload some of your stuff now and then move on. But there will come a time when you'll have to go back to what Tokyo Power does or what the Koreans do and what China does, which is 30-year contracts, etc. When that starts to happen, you're going to be crowded out completely. You won't even get a seat at the table, let alone a chance to actually do a deal. But whereas if you say that the Bahamas is going to become the LNG hub for ships, and that you're going to attract investment here to be for storage and distribution, not only for domestic consumption but for this international market. Once you say that is your agreed national strategy, if that is done, then I can tell you companies like Shell will look at it and look at it very, very seriously, and billions of dollars will be invested on the back of that, if that is the direction this country chooses. From there, let's move on to something else. It's sort of related. The Bahamas and many of the islands in the Caribbean have a growing and seriously difficult issue with waste management. Landfill options are really getting limited, and the pollution of the seas, whichever way you look at it, is tragic. And I've seen it myself. I'm not a diver, but I put my head underwater every now and then. What I see in the Caribbean now is very, very different to 30 years ago. It was almost like a documentary when you put your head underwater. Now you're delighted if you see one fish swim by your wave at you. That is a signal that something has gone terribly wrong. Plastic bags and pieces of plastic. Now, instead of doing that, why not create an industry where this waste is gathered, municipal waste and plastics and everything else, and it's turned into electricity. But whichever country in the Caribbean steps up and picks this up as a business, they will have to accept that there isn't enough critical mass to do it alone. So you have to become an importer of these products and then convert that into energy. And that is a difficult sell to the general public, but it's a policy decision that somebody has to make, because otherwise you will be stuck with the problem, or another country will pick it up. And Cuba is already working with a joint venture British and Chinese company doing this very thing, converting municipal waste, industrial waste, and plastics into electricity. And they're sniffing around Jamaica, and we're talking to them. But it's an opportunity for a country like the Bahamas. Otherwise, what else are you going to do? Maybe you'll strike lucky, and if Jamaica or Cuba runs out of raw material, they might say, okay, Bahamas, you can send your stuff to us too. But this is another real concrete example of something you can do. But on the more positive side, the whole marine ecosystem and the way in which you're developing your awareness of your domain, etc. I think this is something that we want to talk to you about. Offshore exploration for mining material and oil and gas. It sounds a little bit Frankensteinish sometimes, but it is happening. It's a reality. It's a question of not whether it's going to happen, but how carefully these things are managed. At least by working with a British counterpart, we are going to be EITI compliant and have global standards that we will be meeting, and you're not going to be held hostage to somebody who basically dangles a carrot in front of you, but actually that imperils your environment. Now, these are just some examples, and I could go on all day about where these things are. But let me not forget what I call the smaller enterprises, and because that's the mainstay of our economy too. And it is possible in this day and age for individual, just a single person, to actually open business in both directions. Because whether it's through digital platforms, whether it's through brain power and just the IP that they have, or whether it's through having these network of of distribution that is now possible. Most companies in the UK no longer own the entire vertical process. I mean, a big supermarket has contracted out everything in that process. And you can also reverse this thing. In the Caribbean, many of the big brands don't come here because no single market, or even the whole market put together, is sufficiently large for them to invest in their own name. But they'll happily take in people who are consolidators in the middle, and that's a real opening for smaller businesses to say, okay, we will fill a container that regularly ensures that there's supply. So it's not a question of, oh, the phone call's going, cheese has arrived, and now all you go run to buy the specialist cheese, and then 2 weeks later it all runs out. One of the real bugbears of continuous trade is reliable supply chains, and not this sort of the old style of things where one container arrives, you unpack it and you just sell whatever you have. That sort of trading is really not what I'm talking about. So what I see opening up as part of the new trading relationship between the UK and Bahamas is from one-person businesses right up to Shell and everything in between.
Excellent. I mean, that's a vast range of services. And certainly when we look at our unemployment rate and we look at so many of the country's young people who make up that unemployment rate, with a lot of them being incredibly creative, many of them having businesses of their own, it's good to know that we've got that potential for companies as big as Shell and as small as me to make some sort of connection with you once again. So we're excited about that.
And the one thing which I haven't touched on, but it is absolutely vital, people from the Bahamas who visited the UK or have studied there or really have such strong connections, they're almost from there as well as from here. You know that there are at least 1 million people from the Caribbean region who are, if you like, not your counterparts, so just literally waiting to engage and deal with you. And they're similarly placed. Some of them are at the creative end of doing things, and some of them are in that space of being challenged, where education for boys, for example, is a big issue right now. So whatever we think is working in terms of government interventions and social interventions in the UK might be transferable here, and vice versa, because you may have found ways in which the norms here are actually portable to the UK. Because the reason why I say this is that I see a few examples where parents, having become quite exasperated with their young adults, say, enough, you're going to go and live with Granny in Jamaica or Grenada for a while to get fixed. Now, what does that actually mean? It actually means that they value some of the social norms and things from over here. But I think, rather than create these dislocations and further potential problems, you could actually say, well, what does work here? And can those be handed over to the teachers and social workers and other interventions in our country and make that work a little bit better?
And that's excellent. I was actually going to just speak with you about that. You guys are continuing to deal, obviously, with the challenges of terrorism and major issues as it relates to violence in that way. And we, of course, are dealing here with issues of gun violence, of gang violence, and again, this idea of violence, which, though different, has some similar roots and causes. And so is there opportunities for us to engage in this type of transfer of norms, as you say? And what does that actually look like? Is it as sending social workers over to the UK for a course that is sponsored by the Commission? Is it the Commission hosting a forum here on new ways of dealing with violence? How does that actually look in terms of a partnership between us?
No, it is, and I think the root of your question is one which I accept fully, which is that gone are the days where we could somehow create this mystique that we have all the answers and just do it our way and everything will be fine. We have some serious issues in the UK, and terrorism is one of those sad specters, and what is even worse, that it is largely homegrown. And these are not necessarily from families that are otherwise in areas of deprivation. Some of these are university students and from middle-class families and come from parts of the UK where you wouldn't imagine that these things are possible. But we see this here, we see different forms of violence in the United States, etc., that any kind of environment can nurture these things, but the impact is huge. And what does it actually require? It requires what I call 360-degree interventions, almost everything from school to what social workers do, to societal norms, to people keeping an eye on each other, eyes and ears on the ground, the way the government works, so all of those things. And we've had a whole series of exchanges with the security sector here in other parts of the Caribbean. In certain areas like Trinidad, unfortunately the spectre of radicalism has actually come over here. And then the idea that just one person with a weapon can wreak havoc is something that none of us are immune from. So no, there is actually very close cooperation on intelligence, on training, on particularly the challenges you face with maritime surveillance, electronic surveillance, and these things are going on, and that they will continue. But I think even if you take the other sort of crime, the increase in street violence and murders. In my last visit, we were talking to national security people about some of the successes we've enjoyed with street cameras and linkages with the police, etc. And that I think has some real potential here, particularly in the downtown area where there are reasons to look at that. I think migration poses some challenges, and our position in the UK may be unpopular with some, but you have to have some semblance of control over your borders, and that's why we have increasingly bringing in the measures that we are. But I think there was a period where we had a particular problem with gangs of Afro-Caribbean origin, and Operation Trident really targeted the Yardies in a big way. Drug smuggling and people smuggling is still very much a live issue. The drug side is I wouldn't say it's under control, but we've got a good handle on it. On people smuggling, I think it's becoming more and more complex, which is why you'll hear the term modern day slavery is something we are using. It's a bit emotional using in the Caribbean context, but I think most people understand what we're talking about. We're talking about the trafficking of children, women, and men under conditions that are exactly the same as slavery, where people are being forced to work in sometimes in extremely unpleasant circumstances. And many of the routes include the Caribbean, and we're having to intervene on that front too. So there's a lot of work going on those fronts.
Okay, all right, well, that's good to know. Well, our time is winding down, and we've still got so much more to cover, so I'm going to try to limit this to maybe about 2 more questions from me and then open it up to the floor. You, before coming to Jamaica and the Bahamas, spent some time in the Philippines, and while you were there, you were able to assist them after they suffered losses as a result of a major typhoon. Here in the Bahamas, environmental changes, climate change is really impacting us, and we are one of those island states that are going to be severely impacted by sea level rise. We've seen that manifest itself in our hurricane storm systems very recently, and between 2015 and 2017, we were directly impacted by 2 Category 4 hurricanes and 1 Category 5 hurricane. We lost approximately $673 million, and that is a lot. And as we look toward the future, where do we see the UK working with us in terms of being a voice for us, speaking with countries on the G7 level about their energy emissions, about climate change policy? Where do we see you take a stand for us in that regard? And then how do we see you as a partner in terms of building up our resilience and helping us to restore ourselves when we suffer major losses like that?
Now, I'm glad you raised that question, because it's something that I had very, very hands-on experience of, not just in the Philippines but elsewhere. But let's focus on the learnings, not just from the Philippines, but here. But just for the purpose of record, the Typhoon Haiyan, the Philippine incident is known, to this day remains the strongest ever hurricane to hit the planet, at 315 kilometers per hour, and it moved so slowly, it did its job as it went. At that time, the UK was ranked by the UN as the #1 responder in terms of assets, people, money. We had 1,400 people. We had an aircraft carrier, a destroyer, 8 helicopters, a C-130 plane, and a long-range C-117, private chartered, you name it. I mean, it was just in and out of there, and we sustained that effort over 3 months. So this is something that I had really hands-on experience. And when I was presenting my letters of introduction, both here in Nassau and in Kingston, I did say that I have a record of serving in places where natural disasters happen. And they were kind enough to allow me to continue.
Yeah, because I was wondering if you had gone through a big storm. I hope not.
Of course, no sooner had I spoken than we had the weather events. What we saw was very unusual, but I think it's going to be less unusual in the sense that we will see recurring features of what's going on. And we go back to the heart of what we've been talking about for decades. I know that I don't have to convince anybody in the Bahamas But we have many people, including our friend in the north, who basically are denying the obvious. Climate change is real, global warming is real, seasonal patterns are different. Just because we're having a severe winter doesn't change anything at all. And if we want to gang up on these naysayers, we should. And I think the Bahamas and everybody has total license to keep on at this so that there's recognition and we bring the United States and others back on board. I mean, China really went from one side of the equation to another. The reason why the United States is absolutely vital and important is that what was promised was funding for countries that will be able to become more resilient. Now, without the United States at the table for any global fundraising exercise, it's next to near impossible, but not something we're going to stop just because the Americans don't. But it's made our job even more difficult. Because the way we had agreed it would be governments, but it would also be businesses that would contribute to the Global Climate Fund, and then we would unlock all of this in various countries, and countries like the Bahamas would clearly benefit. But if United States Inc. and United States government are reluctant to play, then we really have an uphill struggle. So we're not going to give up on that. But in the meantime, what are we doing? Well, we are putting in some lessons that we've learned from the last series, and those are already being enacted. Firstly, it is to ensure that countries do what the Bahamas this time did, which was to make an official request for assistance before the hurricanes actually happened. Because unless a government formally asks for help, a foreign entity cannot help. And that's not because we're callous. It's a very simple thing. On what basis do our armed forces arrive here? What happens with the goods? How are pharmaceuticals inspected? What do we do with customs? What do we do with vehicles that come in, etc.? Without the host country saying, here's the call for assistance, it's a non-starter. And I had this huge problem in Thailand, where when floods were coming down to engulf Bangkok, where the country steadfastly refused to ask for help, and in the end we couldn't. And the Japanese stepped in because their car plants were going under, and the Thais sort of said, well, look, the Japanese are helping. And I simply said, I'm sorry, if you don't put it on a piece of paper, we can't do it. That's the number one trick. The second one is to respect the regional arrangements that you actually have, the mechanisms that you have, the CHOGM mechanism, or your agreements with the UN and others. The reason why I say this is that through the goodness of their heart, every now and then what actually happens is that heads of government or agencies have their own private conversation offline. That makes it even more difficult. And we had I won't talk totally out of school, but the situation we actually had with Jamaica, respond to Dominica and saying, we will help you, and then suddenly want to deploy troops, etc., but ignoring the CHOGM mechanism. So we couldn't engage with it, but we couldn't ignore it, because then the Jamaican Defense Forces came to us and said, can you give us an airlift? Can you stock us whilst we're there? Can we do X, Y, and Z? What about our arms that we're going to be carrying, etc.? So in essence, that became a double problem rather than a solution, because we were dealing with a one-to-one offer between two countries, plugging it into a bigger CHOGM-led effort, etc. So although it sounds a bit bureaucratic, really the benefit is very, very clear. The other one is charity appeals. The people, organizations, foundations, naturally rise to the occasion and want to do something. You know, the worst possible thing you can do is to send a shipment of a mixed bag of things. If you send a bag full of only rice, that is perfect. But if you send things where it's a mystery as to what's in the box, you actually create a logistical nightmare at the other end. Because somebody has to unpack it, inspect it, make sure that each and every item is still not within the perishable date, then identify where it needs to go, etc. You would need an industry to deal with that generosity just when you don't have the capacity. So that is another thing that is being put into place. But overall, I think you'll see us, the EU, and the Global Climate Fund increasingly devoting resources to countries like the Bahamas. There was a bit of a debate about whether we would help countries that are well off or not. And the UK, you may have noticed, has gone to the OECD to say that where there is a declared natural disaster of a scale, that ruling does not really apply in terms of whether it's development assistance or not. This is not development assistance, it is a humanitarian relief operation. And as we've seen, the statistics of where your GDP was pre-hurricane can be in one place, post it could be totally different. In some of the outlying islands of the Bahamas, it could go from right up there to zero. So we are really talking in a very different way to address these issues, because I think it'll become ever more frequent. And we saw these things developing where they're coming in relays. One of the things we did achieve in the Philippines, and I need to understand it a little bit better here, maybe that it's not a problem, but in the Philippines, when I first started there 5 years ago, there were at least 4 different forecasters, a local one, a Japanese one, a Pacific one, and ours. And none of them were particularly accurate. And I just used to say, well, I can't sort of go with anyone other than the British one. And sometimes we were right and sometimes we were wrong. But we then invested our know-how in full in the Philippine system, so much so that by year 3 or 4, I could ignore all the others. I could just rely on the Philippine system. Now, what I don't know is whether the US-led system here is good enough or not. I would suspect that it is. And if that's the case, at least then we have enough knowledge of what is about to hit us so that we can react properly.
Okay. Well, we certainly do have a pretty good system here in terms of warnings, and it's gotten better over time. But it's something that obviously always needs continuous improvement, especially as these storms become more frequent. So I assure you that I've only got 2 questions left before I turn them over to you. And one thing that I want to find out from you is Commonwealth Heads of Government is coming up. You mentioned CHOGM earlier on. What exciting things can we expect besides the Prime Minister celebrating his birthday? Are there any topical issues that we're sure are going to come from CHOGM? And is it still relevant all these years later to make sure that these heads of government are gathered in one body?
Yeah. And what's fascinating for me is that I was actually head of the Commonwealth Department soon after I joined the Foreign Office. So I did the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2003 in Nigeria, and the Manchester Commonwealth Games just before that. So in some ways it's in my DNA. And typically what actually happens, and I'm being brutally honest with you, is that the host government always wants to get its way in terms of what's discussed and what the outcomes are. The Secretariat, being a representative of the member states, wants to have a wider conversation, and then individual participants with heads of government obviously come with their agenda. So you wouldn't be surprised that when the UK first started on this, we pressed a few buttons. We wanted protection of the oceans as being right up there. We wanted prosperity and a real commitment to free trade. We wanted special attention on the education for girls. And there were a number of others, but these were some of the things that we were leading with. And threat of cybercrime is another one of those things that were being put up there. No sooner had we done that, of course, the Secretariat was saying, well, we have other issues that we want to talk about. And climate change, I think, was coming in a much stronger way. Countries like the Bahamas talked a lot more about the small island development states and their vulnerabilities, the difficulty of maturing from a low-income country to a middle-income country, the pain of graduation. A lot of countries, including Jamaica, said, our problem is not educating girls, our problem is educating boys. So it's almost the inverse of that proposition. Slowly but surely, what is actually emerging, and I'm really happy that it has, that the elements of the UK asks are there, but it has now become much more universal. And if you look at the draft communique as people are working on it, everybody from the Commonwealth will recognize that their interests are reflected in this, which I think is a good thing, because I think the accusation that it is the British Commonwealth is dated. I mean, let me just share one small thing with you, because I think because we have a common heritage, you'll understand this. Many people assume that the Queen and her father before was the head of the Commonwealth because it was a British imposition. It is totally untrue.
Interesting.
The person who made this suggestion and made it happen was the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru. Because as India was becoming a republic, the last thing he wanted was to sever the connections with the United Kingdom and the wider family. And it was he who proposed the idea that the monarch should have the headship of the Commonwealth. And there's nothing in the rule that says, and that is there in perpetuity. In fact, what will happen when that sad day arrives is that the next available CHOGM slot will be when the future will be decided.
Okay.
And then the individual members will decide as a collective as to what actually happened with this thing. So fundamentally, it may have its origins in the UK. It is not a British construct. Mozambique joined the Commonwealth because the invitation came from Nelson Mandela.
Okay. Interesting things. And this is why the Commonwealth is still relevant, because we have these shared histories and this interesting perspective on our world leaders and what they contribute to our dialogue. The final question that I have for you is really more about educational opportunities, particularly for Bahamians. This evening we're very happy to have with us two CHOGM scholars, and they are here in the room, and they have taken advantage of that program, but a lot of people don't seem to know what it is. So if you can just let us know about the educational opportunity through that scholarship and what that does for us as a nation, I will end my questions with you there.
Actually, I'll go one better than that.
Okay.
I'm going to ask Sean to come and tell you. What? Because for me, I would say so anyway. I would say that it's it's been in operation for 32 years. That anybody can study a degree of their choosing as long as they show passion. But hear from somebody who's just come back from the UK.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome the Messi Council, please.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Certainly nice to be put on the spotlight this year, Excellency. But nonetheless, yes, I was last year's CHOGM scholar, and I can simply say it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. I had the opportunity to study at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm a physician, and the educational opportunities is second to none. I can say that. Not only was I challenged in the area of medicine, but I also had the opportunity of making friends from all around the world. And one of the things I was talking to Lieutenant Glenn McPhee, who's also a previous scholar, is about getting the word out about this opportunity. I don't know if I should say sadly, but there's only normally one person selected for the Bahamas. And I'm hoping that can change sometime in the future. Because I felt, I was glad to be in the company of other people from around the world, but I also lacked, like my other friends have, with other CHOGM scholars from their own countries. So, and it's an opportunity of a lifetime for a whole year. It's intense, but like I said, the experience is second to none. I wouldn't trade it for anything. The educational opportunities, meeting people from countries I've only heard about on television or I've read about on the map. The food in London, traveling, even the hotel activities that took place while I was there was a bit of excitement for me. It made me appreciate what I have back home. And now that I'm back, I'm certainly, don't intend to allow my educational opportunities to go to waste. And I do have a question for you, Your Excellency. Hopefully, once the question now comes up, about how we can better make use of our talents here in the Bahamas. So that's the best way I can sum it up. It's an opportunity of a lifetime.
Certainly, excellent. And we're actually going to give you the opportunity to ask that question as soon as His Excellency is done with his comment.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Just a couple of things. Tomorrow we're going to be interviewing the next batch of candidates for the CHOGM Scholarship Program, and clearly we need to do more to get the word out there as to what this is all about. It is very straightforward. If you have a first degree and a minimum of 2 years of work experience with no upper age limit, and you want to study at master's level at any university of your choice, that your qualifications would get you your admission on your own record, then apply. The commitment you have to make is that you will return to the Bahamas. This is not a one-way ticket to somewhere else. And that the passion that you exude for the subject of your study will be converted into something that will be good for your country. So that is the payback. And then you remain a family of the wider CHOGM Fellowship, and we're going to capture you, and I don't think we've done enough of that, which is really the clue to why we are going to be grabbing hold of people like you and saying, let's spread the word a little bit more. And it needn't be restricted to one. It's always moving. When I started in the Philippines, we did 8. When I finished, we did 30 plus 5 science PhDs.
Wow.
So growth is possible, but you can't push a boulder uphill. And quite frankly, I don't think we have enough people here in the Bahamas who really understand the magic of CHOGM. And maybe people just look to the north as their only source of education. But the UK still has some of the world's top ranked. In fact, more of the top 10 are in the UK than anywhere else in the world.
Well, we're now going to turn it over to that segment where we invite you, of course, to ask questions. And we want you to make your questions as succinct as possible. Certainly, our time is winding down, and We know that if he enjoys some good conch salad, we want you to one another again as quickly as possible. So we'll take questions now, and we'll start with you, our Shields scholar.
Okay, so as you know, Your Excellency, my area is in medicine and clinical research. And my question is there any possibility of us getting some assistance from the UK in establishing our medical research council here in the Bahamas that will enable us to do our research as it relates to our health issues, diseases that are unique to us, and to also train upcoming scientists? And if so, how can I get the ball started?
Okay, fantastic question. I was a bit puzzled when I came to the Bahamas and Jamaica as to why a particular government program from the UK is not alive and kicking here. Because the Chiefney Scholarship is up and running and well known. But I told you that in the Philippines I took it from 8 to 30, then plus 5. The plus 5 is under a completely different scheme called the Newton program, named after Isaac Newton, and it is about science. And it was a huge program, and it is still running, but it is not visible. It has zero traction here in the Caribbean. There's not a single jurisdiction where we've actually got this up and running. And when I poke around, they sort of said, well, when we started to find whether there were research institutes or whether there were postgraduate universities, and there was not enough going on for it to be viable. Now, your question actually suggests that there is now in the proverbial chicken and egg situation, which is that we won't start unless there's something there, and something won't start unless we do something. So I think I need to go back and have another conversation with the Newton Fund people by saying, can we not have an incubator part of this project? It's not that they just walk into a fine established place that's already generating these things. And I tell you why it's important. It's important because the areas of discovery are now having to become much more global. And it's no secret that many of the cures or vaccines and others have been found from other experiences, from traditional medicine, from narratives, from people just saying, well, actually, I've never used this, but I've used this, and this seems to work. And you've seen it in cosmetics, you've seen it in other applications. You know, there's a whole world out there. And I think also, without sounding, you'll forgive me for phrasing it the way I do, but I think it might be easier to absorb it from someone like me. But if you look at the way in which even the producers of beauty products and hair products and others have realized that not everybody in the planet is made the same way. And that there's a lot of science behind all of that. But that science has to come from the communities from which these people come from. You can't sort of sit in Scandinavia imagining what it is actually going to work in places like this. So I really need to go back to basics on this and have a conversation in London about the Newton program, because I think unless we re-engineer this thing, we'll just be doing what we've been doing here, which is really exposing you to the best school of tropical medicine in the planet without you having then a counterpart organization here that you can latch onto. But that's no excuse for letting off the Bahamian government or for the host governments here or the University of the West Indies and others. I think, I think people do need to take one step in that direction for somebody else to walk a bit further towards where we're going. But I hear you loud and clear, and it's a vacuum.
Thank you so much for that. That's exciting stuff. We get something coming out of this totally with that new foundation, and looking forward to pushing the University of the Bahamas in that regard as well, so that we can be doing our part to meet you halfway. Interesting fact, there are some sharks right off the coast of Acklands that excrete a very special substance that goes into lots of cosmetics that is bought in Scandinavia. And so the more of those types of stories that we know, the more of those types of experiences we can share, the more we can create our own. We had some other questions. I saw some hands earlier. I thought that we had a question up front here, possibly. No? Okay. Any questions at the back of the room or anywhere else? The mic is coming to you right now.
Good evening, everyone. I too am a former CHOGM scholar. Spent my time in Manchester. It was a wonderful experience. Marissa, was that you in the back? My question, sir, is can you give us the details of when the applications are due, where they can be gotten from, other details that might be pertinent for us to take back to our various organizations. Thanks.
Absolutely. The website is chevening.org, and it also is on Twitter with the same sort of @chevening. So it's very easy to find. The cycle is that we are just basically finishing off the returning Chevening scholars and the interviewing for the next. So that's the old cycle. But once it reopens again, from August until November is when we are going to be open for applications. And in parallel, people have to explore, which university will host them. I'm looking at Samara just to make sure I don't get these dates messed up, because otherwise she'll be very angry with me when I'm done. But that's the window from August until November, where you line up your application, you get your references, you really get your head in the right space as to, and like I said, those two magic ingredients, passion and what are you going to do when you come back. And usually when people fail, they fail because they see this as an academic CV builder, which it isn't. If you say you've got distinction in X, Y, and Z, and you were absolutely top of the grade going through high school, through university, etc., that just gets you into the conversation. It doesn't qualify you for, because it is that extra dimension that we're actually looking for. And thereafter, it really takes its own course. In the case of the Bahamas, at least, you're not going to be squeezed in a different way. In other places where we have multiple scholarships, because we say you can apply to any British university, some people can choose the less expensive ones and some choose very expensive ones, and we'll honor that. But what happens is that our budget gets squeezed. So instead of being able to do 20, we might do 17. But that's a function of the arithmetic, not our desire. And if you fail to get in 1 year, there's nothing to stop you from applying again. And the shortlisting is done objectively in the UK, but then when it's narrowed down, then a panel, like the one we're forming to decide, you're actually forever under this threat of whether you're in or out. And in dealing with the UK, you're dealing with the world's most international, biggest financial center in terms of many areas of international finance. But certainly if you add in the wider services of accountants, lawyers, etc., it is the world's #1 financial center. Now, if financial services remains, as it will be, important to the Bahamas, then the UK is your only natural choice. But my proposition really is that the type of business the Bahamas does is in this value-added space, so that it really becomes something that's easily transferable and interchangeable in terms of what it does with the UK. But more formally, the UK has made a written commitment to all the participants in the agreement that we currently have as part of the EU, that we will start with that being the basis of where we continue our relationship. And that's written down in black and white. And fortuitously and sensibly, the agreement that was announced just a few hours ago between the rest of the EU and the UK is that we now have the green light to negotiate free trade agreements and arrangements with anybody in the world in this period of adjustment, whereas previously we were banned from doing so. So that's when we were cheating a little bit with these sort of semi-formal agreements. So we'll be upfront and discuss. Now, the question that you haven't asked, but I should answer as well, is are we going to forget about the Caribbean and the Bahamas because we've got all the other things to do?
Actually, I was wondering, is the Bahamas still of value too?
It is for a number of reasons, but let me make my point and then I'll come back to it, because your point is a much, much bigger one. It's not really a Brexit point, it's something much, much bigger than that. The point I was making about the importance of the agreement is that it is only on that basis that everything else that we do will be legitimized. Otherwise, we'll sort of fall out of the club. But our aim is to make sure that what we do is backed by the legal agreement that we have with the EU. So that's the commitment that we've made. Now, is the Bahamas important to the UK. I think if you measure it by certain metrics, you'll say, well, maybe we've lost our way somewhere because we shut down our High Commission here in 2005. But these things are never forever. I can't make empty promises or whatever, but I was ambassador to Thailand and Laos when I was just before the Philippines. But I was the last non-resident ambassador to Laos because we set up an embassy there. And these things go in cycles, and I don't rule out the prospect that there will become a time when we will say it's important. I'm glad that the Bahamas has kept its very important High Commission open in the UK. The Commonwealth story, which I've talked about, is important, and the Bahamas is an important member of that. But there are some critical areas, particularly the maritime space. As a member of the International Maritime Organization, as a major operator of cruise ships and of flagging vessels, and the linkages it has with Lloyd's shipping and the insurance industry, etc., it is really tied in such knots and it's such an important sector that it is simply not possible for the Bahamas to be ignored. Then there are legal links in terms of the way in which our legal systems work, the common law heritage. Those are our case laws and yours are dependent on each other in terms of what is actually in jurisprudence. Then the business that the Bahamas does in company formations and structures and the like. There are strong British interests that are woven in them, whether they're individuals or corporations. It is something that is, if you like, another part of that fabric of commerce that is difficult to ignore. So there are many things that are going on. My not concern, but my focus is not so much on the past or even the present. It is actually the future, because what I actually see in the Bahamas, and this is not a criticism, it's just natural, is that people's outlook when they look beyond the Bahamas is naturally to North America. And that it will remain there for all sorts of reasons. But I think that begins in some ways, if you take it to its nth degree, to 100 years from now, what makes the Bahamas that special is slightly different, a bit quirky, a bit as though it belongs to a different hemisphere in legacy and history. You and I understand it, but somebody who's going to be 100 years old will say, what the hell are you talking about? Pirates and booty and sunken ships and Nelson and Columbus. I mean, you might as well be talking about dinosaurs for all that's relevant. So it is about the modern relationship that I really want to build. And part of the reason why we're engaging with you, and we can carry on this conversation, is to say, what will that conversation be in 100 years' time, not the one today. But today, I can find common ground with each and every one of you, one way or another.
All right, well, since there doesn't seem to be any more questions, all right, we have one final question. Well, two. Okay, you can go ahead,
Someone
sir.
behind me?
Yeah. But you can take the mic, he's passing it to you right now.
I would just like to wrap this up as one of your predecessors, a resident here, just to say that I found that an absolutely excellent presentation, not being sycophantic to you, but genuinely. You covered a tremendous amount of ground, and I think because I still live here, my wife and I still live here, we sort of become partly Bahamian. I can feel what Bahamians are thinking about all this. And I know that, because it's been said to me so many times before, that people were concerned when we decided to move responsibility to Jamaica in 2005. And what you're saying in a very guarded, diplomatic way, I hope will be publicized, because I think people will find that very encouraging. And also, I think post-Brexit, and we've all been reading what Boris Johnson's been saying about interest in the Commonwealth, and particularly on trade, because that's something that I could never do all those years ago, because people were just almost not interested, or at least they claim not to be interested. So I think we've moved on to onto fresh ground, and I think it's a breath of fresh air, and I thank you, maybe on behalf of other people as well. Thank you.
Your Excellency, I wanted to just find out from you personally, you covered a lot of grounds in terms of maritime the financial industry. But I want to know, what is your personal view towards the youth development of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, both from your personal perspective as well as from the youth perspective?
And that, of course, is one of our actual Commonwealth Youth Ambassadors,
Yes.
Regional Youth Caucus to the Commonwealth.
Let me tell you a little story, otherwise what I say next won't make sense. When Tony Blair was Prime Minister, he went through one of the periodic reshuffles, and the portfolio that was the Youth Minister's portfolio, we assumed would have just gone from the one person to whoever was holding the wider Junior Minister's portfolio in the Home Office. And the next Commonwealth Youth Ministers meeting was scheduled in Botswana, and I was the Commonwealth head at the time. So about 10 days before the event, we sent a message to the Home Office saying, "We've not heard anything from you. Is your minister going? And is there any way in which you can help?" Because normally they would just take care of everything. And they said, "I don't know what you're talking about, because our minister does not have the youth portfolio." So we went back to number 10 and said, "Who's the Minister for Youth?" And they checked the records. No one was the Minister for Youth. So then they sort of turned on me and said, "Well, you better go to the meeting." So I was both the British Youth Minister as well as the senior Commonwealth official. So my day started at 6 a.m. in the morning and finished at about 10:30 at night with drums and things that keep ministers entertained, but it's deafening for an official who's been working from 6:30 in the morning. But what was interesting and unique about it is what it gave me 5 days of total immersion in the subject that you raised, which otherwise I would not have been able to. I just simply said, "I'm sorry, somebody in the Home Office dealt with this thing, I'm not really sure." What I find striking is that every time a CHOGM comes up, everybody starts to worry about where are the youth and are they engaged, etc. And quite honestly, they don't need this worry. They join enthusiastically, they have their own dynamic, and they make it happen. Whether it's on the business side, or in advocacies, on climate, on being very vocal about certain things, and also understanding some of the things that we are really grappling with in a slightly different way. So I have very little fear that somehow, that the Commonwealth will wither because the youth are not engaged. The youth are engaged, and people like you are testimony to that. I think what has really, really helped is the fact that on social media people can form groups and can publicize who they are and where they are, and they're more accessible. So I really see that energy. But the other thing that I think has changed dramatically, I'm not saying this to patronize anybody, is that the age at which people do other things has come down. So people can go into business a lot earlier and sometimes bypass the formal structures altogether. And people who are in the development of apps or in the music industry or in the creative industry, sometimes they leave formal education for another time. So the thing that we are talking about, thinking it's a grown-up subject of SME businesses and facilitating trade, etc. Well, it needs to engage young people because they're in the business altogether. So I don't think there's a sort of thing of the Commonwealth creating a playground for the young people. So you go and play over there, and whilst we adults really deal with the serious issues of the day, it really is more of an overlap. And the one thing I do like about the Commonwealth youth ministerial architecture is that the youth representatives have the right to speak at the main plenary session. What they say is a matter of record as much as an official from the representing countries. So in that sense, personally, I worry less about what the subject will be raised, is making sure it continues the way it already has been continuing, and it has its own dynamic.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this evening. Your Excellency, thank you so much for coming to the Bahamas and sharing with us. We do hope that you get to enjoy some of that council again. But we also hope that this will just be the start of something great. That in 100 years, as a result of this conversation, trade is seeing new frontiers. The interaction in terms of people and exchanges are seeing new frontiers. That the research that would have been started as a result of this conversation tonight would have really helped us with some of the health challenges that we face. And so this has really been a great opportunity for us to learn from you, to hear the excitement that you have for new plans for the country. And we trust that over time, these plans will come to pass. So thank you again for joining us.
Great, let's carry on.
For you, as you can see, and there are light hors d'oeuvres outside along with some drinks, and we hope that you will talk to one another, take the time to meet His Excellency if you've not yet done so, and that you'll have a good evening overall. Thank you again.